Yeah, as I'm coming off my last pass, we're just at this point planning to kind of climb up, reassess, get our energy back. And I just feel and hear a large explosion at the back of the airplane. I mean, this bright red orange fireball surrounds the aircraft, and I'm immediately pushed forward in my seat. And I know I'm hit. I mean, there's no doubt in my mind that my airplane has been hit by enemy fire.
After the collapse of the Soviet Union, NATO expanded because the Eastern European countries wanted protection from Russia. Just look at their history. We didn't seek them out. They came pounding on our door. And it was right to admit them. Where we made a mistake, NATO collectively, was leaving a gray zone, Ukraine, Belarus, Moldova.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Backstory. I'm Dana Lewis. This week, John Bolton, in his warnings on China and Russia, and how the U.S. needs to decide what it wants to do in Ukraine and decide yesterday. And a new book called Flying in the Face of Fear. U.S. fighter pilot Kim Campbell has a world of lessons on leadership and even parenting that she learned from the cockpit of an A-10 Thunderbolt over Iraq. What an amazing story from someone who's so good at reflecting on how victory and defeat makes you stronger. Just be humble, she says. Our Ambassador John Bolton was the former U.S. ambassador to the United Nations. He's a former national security advisor, and he joins me now. Hi, Mr. Ambassador.
Glad to be with you.
Look, I say it every time. It's really important. You are not somebody who just analyzes Russia from afar. You've been there. You've actually met with President Putin. I deeply respect the insight that you have on what's going on in the Kremlin, as much as we can kind of guess and know. So we talk about a new grand alliance between China and Russia that threatens the West. Are they simply carrying on a close relationship that they've always kind of had, that's ebbed and flowed over the decades, or do you see a substantial change?
Well, I think there is a substantial change. 6 or 8 months ago, I called the relationship an entente. Today, I'd call it an axis. And I think it's continuing to solidify. I think China is very much the senior partner. Russia, the junior partner, obviously the reverse of Cold War days of the Sino-Soviet alliance. But the work that they're doing is being reflected in a number of different ways. For example, one relatively new piece of information is that Russia has apparently agreed to supply highly enriched uranium to China to put in breeder reactors that the Chinese are building. They're building two, one to come online, I think this year, one in 2026. Breeder reactors leave you with plutonium, among other things, which is obviously fissile material for nuclear weapons. That's a very significant reality. And you'd think kind of strange, why would Russia give up its dominance between the two of them in terms of nuclear weapons by helping China make even more? I think that's a sign of potentially of how strong China's superiority in this relationship is, and their determination to get a lot more fissile material for nuclear weapons. So we're focused on the war in Ukraine, as we should be. We're focused on the Chinese threat to Taiwan, as we should be. But in the strategic weapons area, this is a development that really, obviously, I think is far more threatening over the long term to the U.S. and the West than the theater threats that we're now talking about.
Well, then some people would say that we were mistaken all along just to keep these arms negotiations start going with Russia and never including China, because China was always below the 1,000 warhead mark. I mean, substantially with a few hundred nuclear weapons. Was that a strategic error not to try and bring China and other nuclear powers into those discussions?
Well, I think it certainly was in the days after New START was signed and ratified in 2010. You could still say back then that a bipolar approach made sense, Russia, U.S. But I can tell you, as early as 2018, when I was serving in the Trump administration, I said to the Russians, "There's not going to be any extension of New START unless the Chinese are included, because it doesn't make any strategic sense." And I think, moreover, while it's certainly critical in the arms control context of strategic weapons, if there are three major nuclear weapon states, the even more important aspect is how the United States builds its nuclear force to deter and, if necessary, God forbid, defeat two adversary nuclear powers. You could imagine successive nuclear crises. You could imagine Russia and China ganging up together. We've spent half a century in the bipolar nuclear world figuring out our deterrence and offensive requirements in the nuclear field. A lot of debate. Some of the finest minds in America had to help develop that deterrence theory. It's like child's play compared to deterrence theory in a tripolar nuclear world.
So is America now behind the curve in terms of deterrence when it comes to other nuclear powers? I mean, we had mutually assured destruction. Do you think the U.S. is and now the arsenal in the U.S. is said to be badly aging? It is going to be very expensive to upgrade it. There's a lot of debate about how do you upgrade it? Do you use cruise missiles with nuclear warheads? Lots of internal debate in the U.S., but it would seem like the U.S. is now behind the curve on these hypersonic weapons and elsewhere.
Well, I think we are behind the curve in many respects. I think nobody has thought through deterrence in a tripolar world. So I think the Russians and the Chinese are behind as well. But the real question is, before you get to the theory, do we have the capability, or can we scale up in a tripolar world? And I think that really does go to the point you raised. Our current stockpile is aging. I think we need to face up to the reality. We're going to have to do testing, underground testing, of course, but in the near future, to ensure the reliability and safety, not just of the stockpile, but of new weapons we're going to have to design. The Russians and the Chinese both have stolen a march on us in terms of hypersonic technology, probably stolen from us, that we sat on, left in the file drawers during the Obama years. And I would say as well, this is now even more crucial that we ramp up our national missile defense activities, which languished during the Obama administration, didn't do much better in the Trump administration, and are languishing again in the Biden administration. It may be difficult to have adequate missile defense, but certainly from the threat of rogue states like Iran and North Korea and an emerging China, we've got to have something that protects our civilian population other than mutual assured destruction. That was an unacceptable strategy during the Cold War. That's what Reagan's Strategic Defense Initiative was all about. I think we've got to put a real priority back on national missile defense. And by the way, our allies, South Korea, Japan, and others who are Taiwan, very worried about the Chinese threat. For them, even our theater missile defense capabilities constitute national missile defense, and they are very eager to get moving on that.
And then we can turn the corner and start talking about North Korea. And I know you've talked a lot about getting tough with North Korea. But look, I don't have a lot of time with you. I want to talk to you about Ukraine. Jens Stoltenberg, the head of NATO, has come out this week. He says, let's be clear, Ukraine's rightful place is in the Euro-Atlantic family. He told a news conference, Ukraine's rightful place is in NATO. I mean, without question. And he says all the NATO members agree on that. Where do you line up on this?
Well, I was out of the Bush administration in April of 2008 already, but he proposed bringing Georgia and Ukraine into NATO on a fairly fast track. That was rejected by France and Germany. It was a critical mistake for the alliance. 4 months later, the Russians attacked Georgia, and 6 years later, they attacked Ukraine. The problem now for NATO is that we've never admitted a country where foreign troops are on their soil against their will, because that would put NATO into a state of war automatically. And that's obviously the situation we face in Ukraine today. But I think what Stoltenberg is reaching for, and if I understand him correctly, I support the idea, we've got to find a new formula here. Ukraine is fighting a war for its own survival, but also as a surrogate for NATO. They are fighting a war on our behalf, which is one good reason why we're providing military assistance. So I think getting Ukraine better integrated into NATO military structures makes enormously good sense. We've already seen public discussion about how The conflict has revived NATO military cooperation, integrating especially the Central and Eastern European NATO members much more under, let's be honest, U.S. command by the European command, which is also the NATO Supreme Command. I think that makes a lot of good sense, and I think Ukraine ought to be part of it.
I mean, the Russians would say you're pouring gasoline on the fire, that one of the reasons that they invaded Ukraine, and Mr. Ambassador, as you know, there are many reasons that they've given, and they seem to change and bounce back and forth week to week. But they say one of the reasons is that Ukraine was heading for NATO, and they will not accept NATO being in their backyard, on their front doorstep.
Yeah. Look, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, NATO expanded because the Eastern European countries wanted protection from Russia. Just look at their history. We didn't seek them out. They came pounding on our door. And it was right to admit them. Where we made a mistake, NATO collectively, was leaving a gray zone, Ukraine, Belarus, Moldova, east of NATO's eastern border, west of Russia's western border. It was an invitation to meddle and cause trouble. It's exactly what the Russians have done. So I think we just have to look at the new reality. And by the way, I'm very worried about Moldova. It may look like a small country, but Russian forces never left after the breakup of the Soviet Union. It's in Ukraine's rear, threatens Romania and really Central Europe. And by the way, if Russia's worried, they might want to look at their most northern border, where Finland has just joined NATO, adding 800 miles of NATO frontier to their border, caused by what? By their invasion of Ukraine. So if they're worried about ramping things up, let's come back to the root cause. If they hadn't invaded, we wouldn't be talking about this.
There are two different kind of perspectives emerging in the U.S. One is people will be critical of the Biden administration and say that this slow drip of weapons is not going to give Ukraine the muscle that it needs to retake these occupied areas. And at the same time, your Republican Party, there's a lot of splintering within that party where people say, why are we pouring all this money into Ukraine? And former President Trump talks about, solving the whole issue in 24 hours. He'll bring peace and calls for compromise on territory and a ceasefire from people like Macron of France. Where is this heading, do you think?
Well, I think Trump just once again demonstrated why he's not fit to be president. There's nobody else in the world thinks that he or anybody else can solve the Ukraine-Russia conflict in 24 hours. And it is true that there is a spread of some isolationist sentiment in the Republican Party manifested in Ukraine, largely, I think, because of Trump's influence. I don't think it's substantial, at least I hope not. Certainly, I'm working to make sure it doesn't become substantial. Macron is no help. With repeated efforts to find a way to compromise with Putin. And by the way, after his recent trip to China, where he suggested strategic autonomy for Europe and that Europeans shouldn't follow America's lead dealing with China, let me just say to anybody in Europe who's listening, if you want to follow Macron's suggestion to have strategic autonomy, be careful of asking for that, because there are plenty of people in the United States who would say, fine, you can have it tomorrow. Then you worry about Russia on your own. Not a good idea. Look, the Ukrainians were innocent victims of unprovoked Russian aggression here. This war is not their fault, and it's not our fault. It does have benefits for the United States. As Secretary of Defense Austin said months ago, the Russians are feeding their army into a wood chipper, and they can continue to do it if they want to. It's reducing Russia's conventional capabilities. We are getting battlefield testing of weapons, and we'll soon get battlefield testing of the latest version of the Abrams tank. I don't think it's been in combat since the Second Gulf War during the George W. Bush administration. It's had a lot of improvements. Let's see how it does on the battlefield. There have been no American casualties here, and I think it's giving us proof of a lot of our capabilities. It ought to be worrying not just Russia, but China. The Biden administration is certainly guilty of a totally non-strategic approach in its supply of assistance, and that's one reason why the war's dragged on so long. We need a strategy. If our objective is to restore Ukraine to full sovereignty and territorial integrity, let's have a strategy to do that. I don't see it from the Biden administration yet.
You would up the supply of weapons to Ukraine, give them more of what they need. Any example of what that might be?
Well, certainly the F-16, which they've asked for, going back to the beginning, they asked for MiGs, and the Secretary of State said yes, and the President said no. Now they're being supplied with MiGs 13 months later. This is an example of the non-strategic approach we followed. I mean, a strategy is decide your objectives and then figure out what resources you need. It would be a nice time to start 14 months into the war.
Ambassador Bolton, it's always a pleasure to talk to you. I don't know if I come away any smarter, but I always come away better informed, sir. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me. Glad to do it.
All right. Kim Casey Campbell was a fighter pilot and Air Force captain back in 2003, flying an A-10 Warthog aircraft. And she is now the author of a new book, which you have to read, called Flying in the Face of Fear. Welcome, Kim.
Thanks so much for having me. I appreciate it.
It's so great to meet you because we talked a lot about doing this. And so KC, I know what it stands for, but I want you to say it. What does KC stand for and how'd you get that name?
Yeah, so the KC is my call sign, and everybody thinks it's my initials. But really, one of the rite of passages that we go through as a fighter pilot is when we get checked out as combat mission ready, meaning that we can deploy to combat. We get a call sign, and it's generally our call sign for life once we've flown with it in combat. And
so you gotta like it, or you're gonna hate it, really.
One or the other, because we're not in the room when people when they name us. All the pilots are gathered in the room. They tell stories about you, and you walk back into. For me, I walk back into Cheers, and they said your call sign is now Killer Chick, but we'll call you KC for short.
It's pretty good, though. It's pretty good. I mean, if you're going to be a fighter pilot,
I like it.
Yeah, hard to beat that. So your first chapter, I did read the book, is gripping. So, and it really starts with this mission over Baghdad in 2003. And, people don't realize there were some huge firefights as Third ID was pushing their armor towards Baghdad for regime change. The 101st Airborne was in the south, and I was embedded as a correspondent with troops who often were getting pinned down in different places, calling for help from the sky, whether that be Apaches or Kiowa helicopters or F-16s or these ferocious A-10 Warthogs. What happened to you over Baghdad?
Yeah, this was April 7th, 2003. So by this time, I mean, the situation, as you know, was intense. And the way that we handled that from the air is we would take off from Kuwait, fly up to Baghdad, and then we would just get stacked up so that when a call came in, we would be ready to go. And on April 7th, we were doing just as we always did, ready to support troops on the ground. Unfortunately, April 7th was a day of poor weather over Baghdad. And we couldn't actually see the ground below initially. And we got a call that our troops were taking fire. They needed immediate assistance. This was a part of the Third ID, that they were along the Tigris River, hunkered down, awaiting resupply. And members of the Iraqi Republican Guard were firing rocket-propelled grenades into our troops. We got that call for fire, and we plotted everything on our maps. And since we couldn't see the ground below, couldn't see it, and just proceeded over to the target area, tried to get in there as quickly as possible. And then found a hole in the clouds and got down below the weather. And I think this was a little bit surreal for me, actually seeing a firefight from the air that low. I mean, I could see the smoke and tracers going back and forth across the river. I mean, it was very surreal in that this is everything that we train for, everything that we plan for. And yet we're on a mission to try to get in there as quickly as possible.
Surreal, and you're doing what speed at that point?
We're at about, diving down below the weather, we're probably at 350 knots or so, trying to keep our speed up, keep moving, keep mauvering. Because so at the time we're watching this firefight across the river.
Stuff in pretty rapidly and have to process it, right?
Oh yeah, things are happening fast, but it's almost like time slows down a little bit as I'm doing a lot of things in the airplane, but I'm watching the firefight, and then something catches my eye, and I'm realizing there's also these like puffs of smoke and bright flashes, relatively close to my cockpit. And that's a reminder to me to keep my airplane moving, trying to keep my speed up as we're trying to come up with our plan of attack to help relieve some of the pressure off our friendly forces.
And then something goes bang.
Yeah, as I'm coming off my last pass, we're just at this point planning to kind of climb up, reassess, get our energy back. And I just feel and hear a large explosion at the back of the airplane. I mean, this bright red orange fireball surrounds the aircraft, and I'm immediately pushed forward in my seat. And I know I'm hit. I mean, there's no doubt in my mind that my airplane has been hit by enemy fire. I instinctively pull back on the control stick because I can see Baghdad getting closer, and nothing happens. The jet's just plunging to the ground out of control. I remember looking down at my ejection handles thinking, this is about the last thing that I want to do. And just reverted back into training, quickly trying to figure out what's going on. Got lights flashing in the cockpit everywhere. My caution panel is lit up. And I realized very quickly that I've lost all hydraulics on the airplane, which is how we normally fly our airplane. At this point, I know I have a choice, not a great choice, but I can either eject or I can try to get the jet in our backup emergency system. Thankfully, I flipped that switch and the airplane slowly starts to climb up and away from Baghdad. And that's kind of the first moment where I'm like, all right, I think I might actually survive this.
But I mean, you had partially trained to do that, but you've never actually flown an aircraft on manual, have you?
No, I mean, we talk about getting hit by battle damage. We kind of simulate it on a mission, and we'll say, all right, you just took battle damage. What are you going to do? Totally different actually getting hit. The adrenaline was certainly going. But now I'm in this backup system that we train once in. It's called manual reversion. And we do it once in our initial training just to get a feel for how the airplane will fly, because it's much heavier, much harder to control. But we actually never attempted to land in manual reversion.
It would be like taking the power steering off an 18-wheeler or something, right? And trying to turn the wheel. Is it that dramatic?
It's just heavy. And flying it back for an hour back to our home base in Kuwait was, quite honestly, physically and also mentally exhausting.
Well, plus you're wondering what's coming apart behind you. You were hit exactly where, on the fuselage or the tail, or what?
It was the back horizontal stabilizer. And then so a missile impacted there, sent shrapnel into the fuselage and tail section, damaged my flight control systems. But I couldn't see any of it. I mean, we have these mirrors in our cockpit to kind of angle back, and I couldn't see any of the damage. Yeah. So I relied on my flight lead, who pulled up next to me to do this battle damage check, just kind of a look over of the airplane. And he had told me there were hundreds of holes in the fuselage and tail, a hole about the size of a football in that back horizontal stabilizer. And that's about all he told me at the time. After I landed, I figured out that there was a pretty significant amount of damage on the engine. Pieces of the airplane were flying off as I made my way home. So a little bit more damage than I think I initially realized.
Tell me, you talked to the airplane?
Yeah, I said, get me home safe.
Just stay together, just another 10 minutes. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I talked to myself too, just kind of hold it together, well, there was a lot of conversation on the way back, because it's a long time to contemplate whether or not you're going to survive, whether or not you're going to be successful in this. And it's hard not to think about all the worst case scenarios. So we had a lot of conversations on the way home, really just trying to stay focused on flying the airplane, how it was flying, what it was doing, figuring out different speeds that it would be good to fly at. But still, I had to make this decision about, do I land or do I eject once I get back to friendly territory?
Yeah.
And I really felt like,
because the last thing you want to do is put it down early in an Iraq that has just been invaded by U.S. forces pouring over the berm from Kuwait. Right?
Yeah. I mean, the thought of ejecting, at least I felt like if I was outside of Baghdad, I would have better chances of survival and rescue. We talked about landing at Talil Air Base, which we had some troops at the time. I think there was one fire truck. We talked about these things, that there wasn't a hospital, there was no ambulance. And so if I crashed on landing, my chances may not be great. So we elected to go all the way back to Kuwait.
So I'm a pilot. It's one of the reasons I wanted to interview you, because I love airplanes and I love your stories. And I know your book it's got a lot of stuff about leadership, and you have a lot of great stories to tell. And I'm going to ask you a little bit about that. But I actually covered, and I hate to date myself, the first Gulf War, as well as the second Gulf War, the second war with Iraq. And I remember we were based at a base in Doha, Qatar, and that's where a lot of the American F-16s that had been based in Spain were flying missions to free Kuwait and started bombing. And that's where some of the pilots were taken hostage from. Those planes went down very early in the war. And I asked one of the pilots, the American F-16 pilots, do you have any advice for the incoming Canadian pilots who were coming in with their F-18s? And he said, and this could have been for you, he said, you don't want to fly low and slow because even a bad gunner can hit you. So, when that RDWR lights up and you get that SAM spike and you do that chaff weave, boy, that'll get your attention. Keep your mock up.
Yeah, we do our best in the A-10. We don't really have an afterburner or anything like that. So, it is true, right? You don't want to fly low and slow until our ground troops are taking fire and they call troops in contact. And then we try to keep our speed up. At some point, it becomes difficult when you're heavy and low and maneuvering. It tends to deplete over time.
Yeah, I mean, the A-10, and I saw them at Bagram Air Base in Afghanistan as well, and some of the damage that they had taken. They are, and I've read lots about them, they are a beast, right? I mean, they've some of them have come back with half a wing missing, or a third of a wing missing, and they have a lot of armor on the bottom. They can take abuse like no other aircraft, it seems.
Yeah, I mean, the A-10 was designed to take hits while performing its mission. So the cockpit is surrounded by a titanium bathtub. That's what we call it, for protection against enemy fire. Our fuel tanks are enclosed in protective foam lining to prevent fire after battle damage. We have redundant backup systems in our flight controls. So it was definitely built to take hits while performing its mission. I mean, that's what we do. We take the risk to support our ground troops.
So you write about a fighter pilot mindset and a wingman, should I say wing woman? I don't know.
We call it wingman still.
Wingman mindset. Tell me about that.
Well, I think, looking back on my career, I was trying to figure out one of the, some of the reasons that I was successful in this moment of kind of overcoming fear and performing under pressure. And a lot of it comes down to a lot of the training that we go through, and this idea of a fighter pilot mindset and learning from mistakes. One of the reasons that I wrote the book is because I realized how powerful stories are. Like you said, the pilots that flew in Desert Storm, I had read a book about A-10 pilots in Desert Storm. I read about their experiences. I learned about them flying back in this backup emergency system. Their stories, for me, I feel like, is what saved my life over Baghdad. Knowing their lessons, knowing some of the mistakes that, quite honestly, resulted in fatalities. So I think the importance of sharing stories, learning from other people's lessons, that's what a fighter pilot mindset is all about. It's this drive to excel, but we're always learning. We're learning from our mistakes and failures and sharing that with others.
It's so interesting because I've heard you talk about this in some other interviews that you've done. And pilots have massive egos. I mean, there is just, you don't have to see the Top Gun movie to get a glimpse of that, but I've spent lots of times at air bases, and there's a lot of testosterone running around. There's a lot of big egos. And yet you talk about the camaraderie and the ability to learn and rely on one another. And it's interesting because even in a corporate environment, right, you have some pretty big egos running around, but I don't think they're always open, and they don't always perform well with big egos. So how do you strike a balance between confidence, determination, but really working with other people?
Yeah, to me, competence, credibility is essential. There's some ego involved in that, but you also have to be willing to set your ego aside. I think this applies in aviation and it applies in business as well. Like, can you set your ego aside and learn from other people, listen to other people, know that you don't always have the answers and know the best way to do it? We teach at the Air Force Weapons School, and what we teach all of our instructors in the fighter community is that the best instructors, the best pilots, tend to be humble, approachable, and credible. Right. And that kind of goes counter to this idea of ego, but it's the idea of humility and learning from others, being willing to admit mistakes, being approachable so other people will come ask you questions and you're willing to share with them. And then obviously credibility. So I think, there is just a balance, and the best pilots, the best instructors, the best leaders I've seen can be humble, approachable, and credible.
You said that small errors matter, precision matters, and you have to fight to improve.
Yeah. Absolutely. I mean, I look back in some of my early flying days and some of the lessons that I learned. I mean, yeah, they were seemingly small errors, but sometimes those small errors can have a big impact. And it's this focus on attention to detail, always trying to get better. We do that through what we call a fighter pilot debrief after every mission. We're focused on, we do talk about some of the things that we did well so that we can repeat them, but we also really drill down into those mistakes. You know, what was the root cause? What did we learn?
What you're touching on is so important. And I think, look, I've been embedded as a reporter with Russian forces, believe it or not, in Chechnya, British forces, Canadian forces. I think the one thing that is really, I don't know if it's exclusive, but it's been mastered by the American military, are these after-action meetings and reports where they say what went wrong. And in any other army, if you sit around criticizing your commander, you'll be court-martialed, or, nobody does that. But in fact, the American military, whether it's the Air Force or the Army, and I imagine it applies to the Navy as well, they're able to sit afterwards and say, you know what, we didn't get it right. And here's what went wrong. And here's what we needed to do better. And everybody's allowed to speak around that table. I'm sure it doesn't always work that way, but it's pretty remarkable when it does.
Yeah. I mean, we talk about checking our rank at the door, right? Checking our ego at the door so that the youngest, least experienced junior members can provide feedback to the more senior members in the flight. I mean, I've seen it happen, and it allows us to learn from mistakes and constantly get better.
Pilots know that nothing goes according to plan. And you could apply that, in anybody's career, almost anywhere. And how do you capitalize on that? How do you change gears? How do you have the mindset in the middle of something that you've planned for and you've told others it's going to go this way, and then suddenly it's going pear-shaped?
Yeah, I think what I've learned is that nothing ever goes according to plan, right? We tend to build a really great plan, and then something happens, the weather, the enemy, you name it. This happens in life too. And you've got to be able to adapt and adjust. For me, the way where I've been successful there is I put in the work. I prepare, we practice, we talk through these things, and then we plan for contingencies, right? We think about those things that could go wrong. And most importantly, what are we going to do in that moment? How will we adapt? How will we overcome? We think about that worst case scenario and what we will do.
And you've had bad days, and you've spoken about it. Where I think you were doing some competition and things just went really badly, and somebody told you, you just had a bad day. You're just not on your game. You've got to do better. And that's a tough punch in the stomach for anybody, right?
Yeah.
And so it's important that you learn to process that and get a bounce from that rather than get crushed by it, right?
Yeah, I mean, don't get me wrong. Like, it's crushing to hear that. I lost a Top Gun competition, which is our bombing competitions, because I made an error on our safe escape maneuver, which is how we get away from a bomb blast. But my scores were good. And so I was kind of like, well, it's training, right? And thankfully, this is at a young days in flying. I know better now. But I was like, it's training. Does it really matter? And he's like, yeah, all these small errors matter, right? We're constantly working to improve. But these earlier lessons, I'm thankful that someone had the courage to hold me accountable and show me the right way, because then now, as a more senior pilot, obviously I've learned these lessons. I know how important it is to work to constantly try to improve and, to learn from mistakes. And when you make them, you dust yourself off, you get back up and you get back in the fight.
So what do you tell yourself when things are going wrong that kind of keeps your oar in the water?
In the moment when things are going...
I should have a better analogy. Keeps your rudder fixed. How's that? Something like that.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's just like, okay, if things are not going right, but I try to fall back on that training and preparation. I've thought about the scenario. Sometimes it's like, take a deep breath and let's think about how I've handled this in the past. What can I relate to? What can I fall back on? And that planning for contingencies piece, that's why it's so important, because you can, it may not be going your way, whether it's, a mission over Baghdad or a presentation in life. It may not be going your right way, but how do you recover? How do you take that deep breath, fall back on the training, and kind of redirect and adapt?
I bet you your toughest mission is the one that you're on now, is raising 2 kids?
Yes, I have 2 boys. They're 10 and 14. So raising a teenager is by far one of the hardest things I've ever done.
Yeah. You and me both. How do you kind of take that tough fighter pilot mom, motivate them, but not crush them?
Well, it's funny. I try to talk to my kids about a lot of the same things. I mean, there's so much concern over failure, making mistakes, and they really struggle about, kind of doing those things. And it's just a reminder, hey, you're going to make mistakes. You're going to fail at some point. The key is that you're ready in that moment. You know how to get back up again. You know how to know that it doesn't define you. It's just something that you need to learn from and then move on. It's easier said than done. I mean, it's advice I continue to remind myself about as well.
Yeah. Kids are complex, and every one of them's different. And the 2 boys I have 2 boys as well. So, and I know each one is very, very different, and how you approach that. You take a deep breath and try again, right?
Yeah.
You realize you don't always get it right the first time.
I know. And my husband and I will debrief. We'll talk about sometimes our conversations, even with our kids, like, ooh, that one didn't go well. He didn't take that very well. How are we going to do it different? Or what are we going to do differently? So
how's the debrief go? Does it say, a pilot and co-pilot, or, you're to blame for not getting that right? Or does that work out all right?
My husband was also an A-10 pilot and spent 25 years in the Air Force. So having the 2 of us as parents, you're going to get a little bit of the fighter pilot debrief.
But you can take criticism when the left seat to the right seat sometimes, right?
Absolutely.
So that's a great thing to keep in mind. So from a woman's point of view, I mean, I've heard a lot of, and I think many people have, there's been a lot of stories about women who have had a hard time in the Army, and but you seem to tell a pretty positive story. And I was wondering, is that because it was Air Force, or is that because you just got lucky with the group of people that you were with? Or did you bring something to the party that signaled to people, don't mess with me, I'm a serious person, and I'm not going to stand for that?
It's hard to say really what resulted in my positive experience. I mean, I really, those guys in my squadron, being the only female fighter pilot, they were absolutely my brothers. They looked out for me. I looked out for them. I think part of it is, walking into that fighter squadron, knowing I was going to be the only female fighter pilot. I just went in with this mindset. One, I did put a lot of pressure on myself, but I also used that pressure in terms of, I just wanted to be credible and capable on the airplane. I wanted to be a good team player and have a good attitude. I also think, many of the pilots in my squadron, I went to the Air Force Academy with. So I knew them already walking into the squadron. They knew how I had performed at the Air Force Academy. So I wasn't such an unknown, but I don't know. I had such a positive experience. I had a positive experience while deployed and flying in combat. I got to prove myself very early, but I think also them seeing that I could perform under pressure. I mean, I was accepted as a fighter pilot. I mean, the guys in my squadron didn't care about the difference. The jet certainly doesn't care about the difference. And I think that really just set the stage for the rest of my career of being in this very male-dominated environment, but still performing well and being part of the team and contributing to the team in a positive way.
That's great. And I think, your book and your experience can be so inspiring to other women and other leaders as well. The last thing I want to ask you, because I know we're out of time, and that is, your book just happens to come out on the 20th anniversary of Iraq and the invasion in 2003. A lot of people who were there in uniform really felt that this was their moment to fight back for America after 9/11 and the Twin Towers had been hit, and they carried with them American flags and a mission to protect America. Do 20 years later, is it harder to process what you were really doing there, and was it a good thing that you were there at all?
Yeah. I really struggle with this question as well, because I feel like, in that, like you said, in that early stages, I think we all wanted to be there and be a part of it. And for us, especially as A-10 pilots, if there were troops on the ground, we wanted to be there. I mean, we wanted to be there with them. And so we looked at it more from that perspective. But I think, looking back 20 years, and, I think where I struggle is just the loss that whether it was loss of life or just loss of lifestyle with the massive amounts of struggles that have come out of that war. I think that's where I really struggle in looking back. And it's this question of, was it all worth it? And I'd like to think that, the way I look at it from my perspective is we as a team went in there and did it, what we were asked to do. We supported the troops on the ground. We did it very well. And I'm proud of us for doing that. When I look at the larger picture and I look about some of the things that have come out of it, I think that's where I struggle. I mean, you'd like to think it was worth it and that Iraq is a better place. And it may be a better place, but it's hard to know if it was all, based on what we did and our contribution. Yeah. So I don't know. I don't know that I have a great answer. I struggle with that question a lot because of the loss of friends, the loss of time away from family, and the number of people that I know that have been very affected by the 20 years that we spent, in that conflict. I
mean, and people tend to view these things in headline answers. And so thank you for being so open and honest about that, because I know some people I talk to in retrospect will say, that big picture was not for me to decide. I was just a young soldier. I went in there to protect the guys or the people I was with and to come out alive. And that's what I did. And so there's probably a lack of reflection. But I think 20 years in, I have to tell you, on the ground, as we followed the 101st Airborne up through Karbala and An-Najaf and into Baghdad, flowers were being thrown on Humvees. And people were immensely happy to be liberated from Saddam Hussein. Now, what happened after that is a very big, much bigger story that we'll leave for the politicians and the historians really now to write about, because there were lots of right-hand turns after that. But the initial invasion, I mean, to many people was a ticket to freedom and liberation. Some people will listen to this and say that's a very narrow window that I'm kind of looking through. But I can tell you, somebody that was on the ground, that was part of it.
Yeah. And I think, I hope we learn some lessons. Like I hope we look back at it and can pull lessons learned and from a larger scale of political decisions, but also a smaller scale. Like, I guess I'm the optimist. I want to try to pull what we can, the goodness from it. And we learn from the mistakes as well. I just, that's kind of the way that I've tried to live my life. We don't always get it right. And where can we learn from it? Where can we do it better the next time?
Kim Casey Campbell, I know I went way over my time with you, and I appreciate it. But for people listening to it, she is the author of Flying in the Face of Fear. It is not a political book about Iraq. It is really, first of all, if you love airplanes, you have to read it. And it's really about leadership too. And you're so good at just not reflecting on history, but reflecting kind of on how you can take the lessons learned as a fighter pilot out of a cockpit and apply them to a boardroom. So it's a great book, and it's wonderful to talk to you.
Thanks so much. I appreciate it.
And that's our backstory. Thanks to Ambassador Bolton and the wise and heroic Killer Chick Campbell, who, by the way, if she didn't already inspire you, was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross for heroism. And that captain in 2003 later retired a colonel with a mere 1,800 hours of flying time and more than 100 combat missions flown. I'm Dana Lewis. Thanks for listening to Backstory, and I'll talk to you again soon.